Let me ask you this question as I begin. Have you ever gotten stuck in an incredibly boring conversation? I mean, have you ever been forced there and sit to endure a one-sided, mind-numbing torrent of words and thoughts? Maybe you're saying, Darren, I've been experiencing that for the last several weeks here at Skeptic. Well, listen, for the first 20 years of my life, roughly, that was my perception of church. For the first 20 years of my life, if I had to sum up my concept of a church service, it would have been this. A church service is where a guy takes 1 hour to answer a question that nobody's asking. In fact, as a child, when I grew up, my parents for a couple of years would take us to church, take us to Sunday school. But as kids, I had 3 other siblings. We would pretend we were sleeping on a Sunday morning until it was too late to go to church. And so we wouldn't wake our parents up because we were thinking if we're just quiet, they'll sleep in and then we won't have to go to church, because church was incredibly boring for me as a child. And so that was my concept of church. So when I was 19 years of age and I became a follower of Jesus and I sensed in my life that God was calling me to be a pastor, I wasn't excited in the least. In fact, I was a little bit depressed over the concept because I thought to myself, that means I've got to be boring for the rest of my life. I got to be in this service, this gathering where I just have to bore the skull out of people. And then it occurred to me one day, oddly enough, it took me a year or two to figure this out, but one day it occurred to me, hold on, I don't have to bore people. I mean, nowhere in the job description for a pastor does it say you must bore people. And so you should know that we work hard here at Broadway Church to make our teachings as creative and memorable as possible. Admittedly, some weeks are more successful than others, but we do our best. And it also occurred to me that I don't have to be answering questions that nobody's asking. I get to choose the topics. I'm the lead pastor. I can decide what we're going to talk on and what we're not going to speak on. So I don't have to talk about things that nobody cares about. And so know that we work hard as well to be as relevant as possible week after week here at Broadway Church and all of our campuses as well. In fact, that's what Skeptic is all about. This course was devised a few years ago, and simply thinking about what are the most common questions that I've heard over the decades from people who are investigating, exploring Christianity, or outright rejecting Christianity. What are the most frequently asked questions that I hear? Or the most frequently given reasons, maybe even excuses people give for not pursuing a relationship with God? And these 6 weeks as the result of my thinking in that subject, my experience over the decades in that subject. Which brings us to the question tonight. By the way, next week we conclude with the classic question, what about hell? How could a loving God create a place like hell? Isn't that a cruel, terrible thing? And how could someone be happy in heaven if they think their friends or loved ones are in hell? How could you spend heaven happy knowing you have loved ones in this? We're going to answer all those questions next week. So if you've ever thought these questions or know someone who has, come out next Wednesday when we conclude with our Skeptic course. The question today, though, is this. Can you believe in God and believe in science at the same time? Can you follow Christ and follow the scientific method at the same time? Or does believing in God mean you have to deny science? Does studying theological truths mean you have to ignore scientific truths? All of these questions can be summed up in one simple question. Is God and the Bible anti-science? Now you say, where does a question like this come from? I mean, where would anyone get the idea that God and science are in opposition? Why would anyone think this way? Why would anyone believe such a thing? Well, historically speaking, this idea is actually a relatively recent development. People haven't always thought this way. Now, the beginning of science is usually pinned to somewhere in the 16th, 17th century. And believe it or not, a number of key thinkers and scientific pioneers were not only theists, meaning they believed in God, but they are also devout followers of Jesus, Christians. Francis Bacon, Nicholas Copernicus, Robert Boyle, Johann Kepler, Galileo, Isaac Newton, All were giants in the field of science. All were followers of Jesus. Nonetheless, over the last couple of centuries, this idea that you can't believe in God and science at the same time has grown. And this relatively modern idea that God is somehow anti-science is rooted in a philosophy known as scientism. Now, I want to get the words exactly as I printed them on your outline. This is your first blank. And scientism is the idea that we should believe only what can be proven scientifically. We should believe only what can be proven scientifically. That's essentially the philosophy known as scientism. Now, on first glance, this actually appears quite rational and to be quite a reliable worldview. It sounds so reasonable until you actually think about it. I mean, read it again with me. We should believe only what can be proven scientifically. That sounds so solid, so reliable. But do you see the problem with that statement? As your outline says, the problem is that that statement itself cannot be proven scientifically. The problem with that statement is it can't itself be proven scientifically. That's your next blank. You can't prove scientifically that you should only believe what can be proven scientifically. You can't put that claim in a test tube. You can't prove it scientifically. You can't put that claim under a microscope. You can't prove it scientifically. You can't apply the scientific method to that claim. You can't prove it scientifically. That means scientism is actually a self-defeating concept, meaning if the claim is true, that means it's false. If it's true that you should only believe what can be scientifically proven, and if you can't prove that scientifically, then it's a false statement. It's a false claim. So it's a cycle. It's a circle. Now, is God anti-science? Absolutely not. Can a person believe in God and believe in the scientific method at the same time? Absolutely you can. In fact, I am reminded of this reality every time I stand and speak at a Broadway church gathering. Because week after week, sitting in front of me are some of the finest scientific minds in our nation, indeed in our world. Let me just give you a couple examples. Dr. Stephen Lamb is a follower of Jesus. He attends Broadway Church, has for many years. Dr. Lamb is a professor. In fact, he was on the board of Broadway with me for many years. Dr. Lamb is a professor of medicine at UBC. He chairs the provincial lung tumor group at the BC Cancer Agency. He directs the early lung cancer detection research program. In 1999, Dr. Lamb was given the award for Outstanding Canadian Academic Discovery. In 2002, he was awarded by the World Association of Bronchology for his pioneering contributions to the field of early lung cancer diagnosis. Recently, Stephen was given the Distinguished Achievement Award for his lifetime scientific achievements in lung cancer research. Can a person believe in God and believe in the scientific method at the same time? Ask Dr. Lamb. He's normally sitting right there at that table, but he had a board meeting tonight. But he comes to Skeptic every night as a table leader at Skeptic. Is God anti-science? Absolutely not. Dr. Mano Javadan is a follower of Jesus. He attends Broadway Church. He also sat around our board table with me for years. He's usually a leader at Skeptic as well. He has been for years, but he's not here this year. Dr. Javadan is a neurologist at Vancouver General Hospital. He's not only a distinguished neurologist, but he has also been the director of the neurophysiology lab. He served as the president of the Canadian Society of Clinical Neurophysiology. He's also served on the executive board of the Canadian Neurological Society Federation. Can a person believe in God and believe in the scientific method at the same time? Ask Dr. Mano Javadan. Is God anti-science? Absolutely not. I mean, I could go on and on. This congregation is filled with men and women working in the medical, scientific fields, researching, testing, expanding, applying their scientific knowledge. Sitting every Sunday in church is Dr. Mayong, a leading physician in the field of oncology and pain management. She's sitting right over there at that table. Michael Monaghan, ask him. Sitting in another section every Sunday, Dr. Michael Monaghan, who holds a PhD in computer science. Perhaps best known as a co-author of the Maple computer algebra system, one of the top-rated mathematical software systems in the world, Michael is a professor of mathematics at Simon Fraser University. You don't become a PhD in computer science and a professor of mathematics without being committed to following laws of logic and the scientific method. He's also committed to following Jesus. You can ask him. He's sitting right over there, leading a table at Skeptic. Where are you, Michael? Right there. His wife, Dr. Gladys Monaghan, who is a professor in computer science department at Langara College, is right there with him at that table. She's also a follower of Jesus. Sitting in another section is a Broadway church every Sunday is a university professor of chemistry. Sitting in another section for many years, a renowned physician who literally wrote the university textbook in the field of radiology. And these are just some of the ones that come to my mind in a congregation of over 3,000 people. Do these men and women believe in science? Yes. Do these men and women believe in God? Yes. God is not anti-science. To put your faith in God is not to deny science. The two worlds don't clash, nor do they compete. In fact, they work together. Let me show you how. What does science study? The word science literally means knowledge. Scientia is the word that's based on scientia. And it literally just simply means knowledge. However, the word has come to represent the study of a certain field of knowledge. As your outline says, science studies the physical and natural world. Science studies the physical and natural world. So the word science has evolved to come to represent the systematic study of the structure and the behavior of the physical and natural world through experiments and observation. Now, this system of observation and experimenting is called the scientific method. Science wants to know how things work. Science wants to know why things work the way that they work. So as your outline says, science studies creation. Science studies creation. And scientists devote the best hours of their lives to investigating, testing, researching our world at both the telescopic and microscopic level. Science is exciting. Science is always expanding. I love sitting down and having lunch with scientists and talking to them and picking their brains. As men and women, they uncover new insights about the physical world around us. Science is a wonderful field of knowledge, but it is only one field of knowledge. This fallacy of scientism is that it sees science as the only field of knowledge. The fallacy of scientism is it claims to be the only way to discover truth. You cannot prove scientifically, through the scientific method, that you woke up this morning. I can't prove through the scientific method that I graduated from high school in 1981, and I did. But I can't prove it scientifically. I can't prove scientifically that flowers smell nice, or that I played on the hockey team in college. Or I can't prove scientifically that a sunset is beautiful, or that I played football in high school. And all those things are true, but I can't prove them scientifically. Science is only one field of knowledge. And as followers of Jesus Christ, we can use our minds to study science, and we can also use our minds to engage in the study of theology. But we saw that science studies the physical and natural world. So what does theology study? Well, as your outline says, theology studies the metaphysical and supernatural world. Theology studies the metaphysical and supernatural world. Now, what does that mean? Meta simply is Greek meaning beyond, so it's beyond the physical. And supernatural, super means above, so above the natural. Beyond the physical, above the natural. Metaphysical, supernatural describes a realm of reality that can't be seen under a microscope or placed in a test tube. Metaphysical, supernatural refer to the realm of spirit, of the soul, even of the mind. Not the brain, the mind. So think in these terms. If science studies creation, as your outline says, theology studies the creator. If science studies creation, theology studies the creator. And these two areas are not in conflict with one another. They're simply focusing upon different areas. Let me put it this way on your outlines, or on the whiteboard here. This isn't on your outline, but you might want to put it somewhere. Kind of a handy little way of thinking in these terms. So, science wants to know how creation works. Science wants to know how creation works. Theology wants to know who the creator is. Science focuses on what God made. Science focuses upon what God made. Theology focuses upon what God thinks. Science studies the footprint. And theology studies the one wearing the shoes. That's kind of how I phrase it. That's how my mind works. Maybe that works for you as well. Science studies how creation works. Theology studies who the creator is. Science studies what God made. Theology studies what God thinks. Science studies the footprint. Theology studies the one wearing the shoes. See the difference? They actually see how they're similar. They actually work together. Okay, let's do a quick review. We're moving quickly through this. Is God anti-science? Absolutely not. This idea that God is anti-science is a fallacy spread mostly by those who adhere to the false view known as scientism. God's not anti-science. Christ followers are not anti-science. Science is the study of creation. Theology is the study of God's being. You can study the Creator and you can study His creation at the same time. Properly done, scientific studies and theological studies don't conflict. In fact, they overlap, or I think of them as parallel tracks. Think of them like train tracks. And those parallel tracks of science and theology, they work together. In fact, when they're side by side, when they're both done properly, they strengthen each other. In fact, they keep you moving forward. When you're properly doing theology and properly doing science, they keep you moving forward. They're parallel tracks side by side. You say, well, Darren, how do they work together? Well, as your outline says, theology makes science possible by providing an ordered world. Theology actually makes science possible by providing an ordered world. See, this whole scientific enterprise is based on certain assumptions which cannot be proved scientifically, but which are guaranteed by the Christian worldview. For example, one of the most basic assumptions is that we live in a world that's rational, a world that's orderly, a world that's structured, a world that operates according to dependable laws. Without that understanding, that assumption, you can't do science. Otherwise, what you're studying right now will not be true 10 minutes from now. But we study these things and call them laws. Remember, we learned, I think, in week 1, laws are descriptive, not prescriptive. Laws tell us how things operate, not how they should operate. We call them laws, but it's just a word we use to describe how the universe seems to be operating. One author in the Bible, from 2,000 years ago, put it this way. He said, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, like his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. That foundation of reality, of order and design and structure, it's built right into our universe. It reflects his nature. God's rational nature is revealed in his creation, and it's the foundation for all scientific activity. We study it believing our world is rational. Again, we need to emphasize that science could not even exist without this assumption, and yet this assumption cannot be proven scientifically. This is a theologically based assumption grounded in a Christian worldview. And historically, that's exactly what happened. Christian theology provided the philosophical foundation upon which modern science was built. This is a historical truth here. People forget that the entire university system was initially set up by the church. Oxford, Cambridge, University of Edinburgh, University of Paris, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Princeton, Rutgers, all founded by Christian churches. And the list goes on. So is God anti-science? No, not at all. Science studies creation and theology studies the Creator. They are different areas of study, but sometimes they overlap. And we've just seen that when science and theology do overlap, when they do work together, theology helps science by providing with the foundation of the ordered world. But it works both ways. Science helps theology as well. You say, well, how does that work? How does science help theology? Well, as your outline says, science aids theology by verifying and falsifying some theological claims. Science helps theology by verifying and falsifying some theological claims. When religions make theological claims about the natural world, they are overlapping with the realm of science. They're making claims which scientific investigations can either verify or falsify. So science can show that a theological claim is true, or science can expose a theological claim as false. For example, the claims of the Greek religions that the sky rests on the shoulders of Atlas, or some Indian religions that the earth rests on the back of a great turtle, were both falsified by science. As well, claims from Eastern religions that the universe is eternal. We learned a few weeks ago that's essentially been falsified by the modern understanding of science, and that we live in a contingent universe, a universe that had a beginning. One of the most notorious examples was the medieval church's condemnation of Galileo. The church falsely interpreted certain Bible passages, like Psalm 93:1, which says, "The Lord has established the world, it shall never be moved." Not so a poetic statement that for a longest time, churches were misinterpreting. Based on a faulty understanding of this verse, a faulty hermeneutic as it's called, medieval theologians believed that the earth was stationary and the sun moved around the earth. That was called a geocentric view. So for the longest time, it was taught that the earth stood still and the sun went around the earth. Galileo, who was a devout Christian, showed through scientific experiments and following the work of Copernicus, who was a devout Christian, that, in fact, the earth moves around the sun. It's heliocentric, not geocentric. So through scientific experimentations, they said, you know something? This teaching for the longest time is false. We're not geocentric, we're heliocentric. It's not that the earth stands still and the sun goes around the earth. It's the other way around. The sun essentially is still in our galaxy and the earth's going around the sun. But this concept that the church is a bunch of theologians sitting in a back room saying, we've got to hide the truth. Okay, this is what they've discovered. Science has discovered this. We need to kill these people, and we need to hide this truth and bury the truth so we can control people. This false narrative is false. See, what is ignored today is the truth that the church was merely parroting the views of the scientific and philosophical communities at that time. The ancient Greeks had long taught that the earth was the center of the universe. The Aristotelian model was an earth-centered solar system. And this Aristotelian model was being challenged by the new Copernican model, by Copernicus, of a sun-centered solar system. So Copernicus, like I said, like Galileo, was a follower of Jesus. His remains are buried to this day in a Polish cathedral. So at the time, the church was holding on to the existing Aristotelian model because the church did not believe that there was sufficient evidence to overthrow that model. However, the church slowly, slower than it should have, but eventually came to admit its mistake. So that's an example of science falsifying a religious claim. On the other hand, science can also verify religious claims. For one example, one of the foundational doctrines or teachings of the Christian faith is that God created the universe out of nothing a finite time ago. The Bible is the first sentence in the whole Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Bible teaches that the universe had a beginning. Now, you should know, this teaching was rejected by both ancient Greek philosophy and modern atheism for centuries. Both claimed, ancient Greek philosophy and modern atheism, that the earth was eternal. Bertrand Russell, in his famous debate, when asked about the universe, he says, well, the universe just is, that's all. It just is. It's a brute fact. It's been eternal. It's just always been here. Then we learned week one in 1929 with the discovery of the expanding of the universe and the Hubble telescope and the redshift and all that went into that. Against all expectations, science verified the theological prediction. Science verified that the universe, in fact, had a beginning. Robert Jastrow, head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, described it this way. I quote from his book, God and the Astronomers. He said, "The scientist has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries." Now, in my mind, I see a primitive scientific verification in the Gospel of John, one of the first century biographies of the life of Jesus. In John chapter 20, John was an eyewitness to the resurrection. He was a follower of Jesus. It's recorded that Jesus made appearances to the apostles, the 12 disciples, if you can think of them in those terms, after Jesus was resurrected from the dead. However, one of the apostles, by the name of Thomas, wasn't around when Jesus appeared to them. Thomas heard the claims from his fellow apostles that Jesus had risen from the dead, and Thomas doubted. That's where we get the phrase doubting Thomas. When Thomas heard their report of the resurrection sightings, this is what Thomas said. I quote him. He says, "Now, unless I see the nail marks in his hands," because he was nailed to a cross, "unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hands into his side where he was stuck with a spear in his side, unless I do that, I will not believe." In modern vernacular, Thomas said, "I need it scientifically verified." So listen to what happened next, according to John's report. I quote again. "A week later, Jesus' disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them. So he appeared and said, 'Peace be with you.'" Shalom is the Hebrew phrase. Then he said to Thomas, "Thomas, come here. Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Now, here in my thinking is an example where a primitive scientific experiment was utilized in order to verify a theological claim. The disciples had claimed that Jesus, who had clearly and publicly been killed by crucifixion, was once again alive. Thomas doubted that theological claim. Thomas required more evidence, a physical verification that Jesus was alive. And due to the importance of his apostolic testimony that it would have for centuries, Jesus provided Thomas with the physical proof that he had requested, the scientific proof that verified the theological claim. So then, theology aids science by providing the philosophical foundation of an ordered universe, and science aids theology by both verifying and falsifying some theological claims. So let's begin to sum up tonight's teaching. Tonight, we've done our best to answer the question, is God in the Bible anti-science? We began by showing where such a question comes from. We learned that it's rooted in a view known as scientism, the false view that the realm of science is the only way we can access truth. We then contrasted the realm of science with the realm of theology and showed how these two actually are complementing one another. And when these two realms overlap, they actually work together to strengthen each other. In fact, here's a phrase you might want to jot somewhere. When truth is your target, facts are your friends, no matter where you find them. When truth is your target, facts are your friends, no matter where you find them. So are you a woman or a man of science? Do you value the scientific method as a way of accessing truth in your world? Great. Keep at it. Stay the course. Keep pursuing truth about the physical and natural world around you. But don't forget that there are truths that cannot be accessed by the scientific method. Don't forget that there are truths that can't be found in a test tube. Don't forget, when truth is your target, facts are your friends, no matter where you find those facts. Are you a follower of Jesus? Do you find yourself fearing or resenting the realm of science? Why would you do that? That is not a biblical response. As a follower of Jesus Christ, we pursue the truth. As followers of Jesus, we follow wherever the evidence leads us. Because when truth is your target, facts are your friends, no matter where you find those facts. One last thing. The tension between science and theology most often surfaces when it comes to the whole discussion regarding origins, the whole evolutionary debate. Did God create the world in 6 literal days or a few thousand years? Or did God use the evolutionary process that began at the Big Bang over roughly 14 billion years ago? Did you know that you can believe either of those options and be a follower of Jesus? It's true. Hear this. There are godly, intelligent followers of Jesus that are on both sides of that debate, that are all over that spectrum. There are godly, intelligent followers of Jesus that believe that the earth is relatively young, that God specially and instantly created each initial creature. There are also godly, intelligent followers of Jesus who believe that the universe is billions of years old, the earth is millions of years old, that God used the evolutionary process to bring about life as we know it. We say, how can that be? I mean, how can Christians reading the same Bible come to such radically different conclusions? Because when it comes to the origin of the universe, the Bible commits us to only 3 things. I read a moment ago, Genesis 1:1. Jot this somewhere on your outline. So Genesis 1:1, first of all, the Bible commits us to when? In the beginning. Very first verse of the Bible, in the beginning. So the Bible commits us to when? In the beginning. The Bible commits us to who? God. It says, in the beginning, God. So we're committed to when? We're committed to who? Thirdly, the Bible commits us to what? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the first verse in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So I'm committed to when? In the beginning. I'm committed to who? God. I'm committed to what created the heavens and the earth. I'm not committed to how. The Bible doesn't say how. It just says this is what God did. When it comes to the how question, we are free to follow where the evidence leads. Because when truth is your target, facts are your friends, no matter where you find them. So did you come into this room this evening thinking you couldn't study the Bible and a scientific textbook at the same time? Don't believe that lie. As we learned last week, truth is whatever agrees with reality. And reality isn't limited to the physical, natural world. Study God, study God's creation, and follow the evidence wherever it leads. Now, chat about this around your table, and then we'll have a Q&A time to conclude tonight. So that was what would be called metaphysical naturalism, the view that all that exists is the physical realm. That's all that exists. So that is all reality. Or philosophical naturalism, let me put it that way. Philosophical naturalism, that's all that exists. You can't have any other factor involved. But that in itself is a worldview that is just an assertion. That's what we're claiming. Well, what's your evidence for that? Well, we don't have evidence. That's our assertion. If you're here and you're a scientist, you would probably work under what's called methodological naturalism, meaning that you have to work as though God's not intervening. So if you're here and you're a doctor, or you're a researcher, and you say, well, God did that. No, that's not an option. Methodologically, it's not on your table to say, well, God did that. You're doing all that you can use as a response or as research is the natural realm. You're working within the natural realm. But that doesn't mean that you cannot believe that God is operating outside of the natural realm. So there's philosophical naturalism, the assertion that the natural world is all that there is, and then there's methodological naturalism. You can be a theist and a Christ follower and follow methodological naturalism in your professional life, but believe that God's operating and created the universe. So another false concept when it comes to miracles is it used to be said, I think David Hume said this years ago, it's now been debunked, but the concept that miracles are a breaking of the laws of nature. And that's not true. Miracles are an intervention in the laws of nature. There's a huge difference. And the example that is often used is, okay, I used this before and I dropped it. So let me hope I do it right this time. So, gravity, something falls at 10 meters per second, right? 10 meters per second squared is the rate of something. And so that's the law of gravity. And there you go. I just didn't break the law of gravity. I intervened in the law of gravity. I stopped the law of gravity from being activated at that moment. And that's what God does. That's what a miracle is. By definition, it's an intervention into the natural law. It's not breaking it. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
According to the biblical narrative, and whether it's literal or whether it's a poetic device is what people discuss and debate, and godly, intelligent people are on both sides of that. There's a whole genre, it could be a whole genre of a creation narrative, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and then Genesis 12 on becomes this historical narrative. But essentially what the creation narrative is describing is that God is the source of all that is. God is so the moon isn't a god, the sun isn't a god, and these other, creatures aren't themselves gods. They are all created things that God created. And then the ultimate creation, the final creation, the pinnacle of God's creation was humanity. We uniquely are created in God's image. So we are created at a higher level than the animals, all other creatures. We're distinct from all other creatures. Us and angels, I believe they would also be created in the image of God. Meaning they're rational, we have a will, we have emotions and intellect and so on. So as to why God did that, and I'm going to allow you to have a follow-up in case I'm not answering it correctly. Why God did that is because God wanted to have a loving relationship. He wanted to express his love, and he wanted to create creatures that could experience love. He wanted us to have the highest level of living possible. And then he created these other creatures for our enjoyment as well. And so it's part of his design, how he designed the universe and designed the world. And why he created us, that was for his own pleasure, for his own enjoyment, for his own purposes. And that's sort of the key with philosophically with the Big Bang cosmology. What a contingent universe, a universe that had a beginning, there's certain, when you tease it out, when you face it rationally, if everything, the Kalam cosmological argument it's called, whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's sort of that premise is really, that's a rational foundation. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. And we could back that up with scientific, observation. Therefore, the universe has a cause. But when you tease it out, that cause of all matter, space, time, energy has to be outside of matter, space, time, and energy. You can't be the cause of space and time and matter and energy and yourself be space, matter, time, and energy. You have to be outside of that. So that means God, as he exactly describes himself, God is spirit. He is mind, unembodied mind. So God's not a physical thing. God's not even complex. God's incredibly simple. God is an unembodied mind. And this unembodied eternal mind spoke matter, energy, being into existence at what we would now call that, that moment of the Big Bang, if you will, the singularity, though people debate on the nature of the singularity. But so, yeah, God is outside of that as the creator of that. Yeah. So again, even there's a continuum when it comes to that. There are Christ followers who believe that God wound up the universe. Now, this isn't deism where God's outside of the universe and doesn't care, but God is present, but he created matter, energy, and all that, and he set it off knowing in his omniscience how it would unfold, and he simply let it unfold using the evolutionary process. Just stepped back and didn't involve himself in it. So there's that. There's also something called progressive creationism, which is, some might call it a version of theistic evolution, where God intervened in the evolutionary process. And he nudged it this way and he pushed it this way, but he used that process. So there's a spectrum, there's a continuum of beliefs in all of that. So yes, I know many people who would hold that God used the evolutionary process to bring about life. I myself would probably hold to that view. So there's a creature called the Y chromosomal atom and the mitochondrial Eve. Okay, so, and geneticists have come to realize, and they've studied this, and looking at the genetic makeup of all humans and so on, they realize there is a single male from which all our Y chromosomes come. Okay, and this isn't necessarily a theistic view. This is atheist geneticists would say this, that they've traced it back, and there is a single atom, they call them Y chromosomal atom, from which all of our chromosomes come. And then they have a mitochondrial Eve, they call her, the single female from which all our mitochondria descend. And they've been studying this. There's been an explosion in this area recently, and it was once believed that these two individuals lived far apart in time. So you can trace it all back genetically. There was an original Adam guy, and there was original Eve, but originally they were thought to be far apart. However, recent genetic research has, it's continued to narrow the dates until recently. These two could have been, they'll acknowledge, actually contemporaries. The most recent research I've read is that the Y chromosomal atom lived any time between 120,000 and 160,000 years ago. That's what they would say. So Adam, Y chromosomal Adam, lived 120,000, 160,000 years ago. And the mitochondrial Eve, they say, lived any time between 99,000 and 148,000 years ago. So there's an overlap. So all of a sudden, genetically, they're acknowledging, and again, this is not a biblical argument. This is just from pure genetics. Now they're recognizing there was an original Adam and original Eve. They lived and they overlapped. So it is quite possible, not saying it's true, biblically I think it is, but they actually overlapped, from which all humans genetically came from them. So the Noah is not a bottleneck. Proposing God as the creator is not a God of the gaps. God of the gaps is an old phrase that, when you're studying something and you have this gap, you come to the end of our knowledge and you say, well, God did it. And it's very intellectually lazy, and they call that the God of the gaps. There's a gap there, and you just fill it with God. Well, God did it. We're not saying that. And nowhere during the last 5 weeks have I used a God of the gaps argument, because they stink, those arguments. They're weak. And so I've not used any. What we have done, like from the Kalam cosmological argument in week 1, we have used science to support an argument, a premise in a philosophical argument with theological conclusions. So we have used science to prop up a premise in a philosophical argument with theological conclusions. That's not God of the gaps. That's simply rational arguing. And so, but to say that God is the source, the first cause, is not a God of the gaps, because there is no physics of nothing. Okay? So at the singularity, when the universe came to a very beginning at t minus 0 or whatever, you can't plug in science there, because science is the study of nature. Well, there is no science pre-nature, right? So it's not a God of the gaps argument. I'm not filling in God where we're going to find a natural explanation. There is no natural explanation for pre-nature. And even saying pre before time is sort of irrational, but for the sake of this conversation, it's not a God of the gaps argument. We're not plugging in God in the absence that will find some. You can't find a natural explanation for nothing. You understand what I'm saying there? So out of nothing comes nothing. So the universe could not have popped into existence out of nothing. And that's not a God of the gaps argument. That's logic 101. From nothing, nothing comes. And but here we are. And the universe has been seen to be expanding. That means it had a beginning. So again, just connecting the dots, that means it had a beginning, but it had to come out of someone, not something, but someone. The only thing that it's not, the source had to be abstract, not concrete. It had to be. I'm going down a bunny trail, but so God of the gaps. I've not used God of the gaps. Put it that way. Very well said. It's what the intellectual price tag, I love that phrase. The intellectual price tag of atheism is out of nothing came everything by itself. And if that's the price tag of being an atheist, you can pay that price tag. I'm intellectually not prepared to pay that price tag. To me, that's irrational. And what's so peculiar about universes? If things can pop out of nothing, why not cars? Why not Stanley Cups? Why not elephants? Why are universes the only things that can pop out of nothing suddenly? Why are we not afraid that in this room, any moment, a 747 could pop into existence? So if it's possible for things to come out of nothing suddenly, you think all science would cease, because things can just come into existence. Thank you for that question. There's an old saying in hermeneutics or whatever I'm studying, when common sense makes the best sense, seek no other sense, or you get nonsense. Okay? And so when you're reading something, you have to understand the genre of literature. So I don't read a math textbook the same way I read a poem, because there's different genres, You don't read a police report like you read, the Psalms. Or a fable, a fairy tale. You realize there's different genres, different styles of literature. And so you don't make something like when the Bible talks about the trees of the field clap their hands. We're not thinking, trees are doing this and clapping. No, we understand it's a poetic device. And it's the same with Genesis. You've got to look at this stuff and realize what's literal and what's not. So when Genesis says, God formed Adam out of the dust in the earth and he breathed the breath of life into him. The Bible isn't teaching that God leaned over, opened the mouth in this dust and went, we know the Bible's not teaching that because that same Bible says God is spirit. And so God isn't a physical being who's doing this. Clearly it's teaching something that God somehow, in whatever process we don't know, we're not committed to how. Somehow God formed humanity and God is the source of life, of the spirit of that being. How that happened, I don't know. Bible doesn't say. And so you don't know, I don't know. But I do know God somehow is the source of that life. That's all that Genesis is trying to communicate. And God's trying to communicate that. Think about that. God's challenge was to communicate that truth, that simple truth, to people thousands of years ago without any medical knowledge, any concept. And we think we're so smart now, but who knows if life's still around, the world's still around, and 1,000 years from now, they're going to look at our scientific knowledge and go, they believe that. But we think we're so intelligent now. But so God had to communicate. He is the source of all creation, and he brought everything into being to every type of culture, every level of intellect possible. And he did it through the Genesis narrative, and it works. And it has worked for thousands of years. Yes, God created the conditions in the universe where that is how his creation operates. So God is the source of that, but God is not making water turn into ice. That is, if you remember a few weeks ago, week 3, when we talked about suffering and evil, if you're here for that, and we talked about with natural evil, meaning evil like storms and things like that, suffering that comes from that. We talked about we live in a world that's orderly and in a world that's predictable. And gravity is your friend when you're sitting in your chair, so you don't hit the ceiling, and gravity is your enemy if you're on the ceiling and you fall. And the same gravity can be a friend or an enemy at the same time, depending on where you are. But that's the reality of living in an ordered, predictable world where I can make choices and live out my choices and decisions. And that's part of the price of living in a physical world. And so water turning into ice and so on, that's one of those laws, one of the ways that God's creation works in a predictable way. So God's not doing it every day. He set that off, he set it up, and that's how it operates. Now you got into meddling now, okay? That's a great question. I personally think that is a naive, unwise approach. And I don't see it as a biblical approach. In fact, I know it's not a biblical approach. The Apostle Paul, one of the leaders of the early church, he said, hey, take some wine for your stomach. Don't just be drinking water all the time. And so there's advice, medical advice given within Scripture, So God, but if you think about it, even most medicines, when you get right down to it, at their root are herbs and, it's natural ingredients. So it's just, we're learning the medicinal qualities of God's creation. And so it's not ungodly or unchristian or unspiritual to use God's creation to help us help us in times of need. So these same people would probably, if they broke their finger or their leg, they'd probably use a splint, to tie a piece of stick here to help you or to walk or whatever. That is no different. You're using creation to intervene, to help you heal. It's no different than medicine or anything like that. So for a person to think that, now at their core, at their heart, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, they're well-meaning. They're trying to show that they trust God. And so I respect that, what they're trying to do, but they're misguided in doing that. And I know this because I once did that as a brand new Christ follower. I've often told the story, I won't bore you with it now. But I did something very dangerous because I thought I had to prove to God that I trusted him that he would heal me. I've had 2 cornea transplants over the years, and this was before I had that, and I was proving to God that I believed he could heal me, so I did something very foolish. And after I did it, I realized, what am I doing? This is madness. But it was that same philosophy that I'd bought into as a brand new Christian. And it's unwise, it's unbiblical. So, yeah, God can intervene, okay? And so God can intervene into our world. He can miraculously heal. He can intervene. But miracles, by definition, are rare. That's why they're called miracles, right? So he can. I've seen him do it. And he does answer prayer. So we can pray for all sorts of things in our lives. I pray daily. I prayed today, okay? And for God's intervention in my life and in the life of my family and so on. Because I have seen him intervene and I know that he does. And he commands me to do this. And then I trust him with the results. So that's what trust is all about. It's bringing our needs and our requests to God and then trusting him to do what's ultimately best. There's all sorts of options and answers for these from which you can choose, and ultimately we don't know exactly, but there are rational responses to each of those, and again they're on a continuum. Where did Cain, Adam and Eve, and then they had Cain and Abel. Of course, Adam and Eve lived for a long time without contraception, so they had more than 2 boys. Okay, and they're both pretty good looking, I imagine, because God made them. So they were attracted to each other. They had lots of kids. But where did Cain get his wife? Well, ultimately, if you're going to be very literalistic, he would have had to have married a sister originally. You just can't get away from that. And you say, well, that's against the law. Well, actually, the law didn't exist yet. So that's like saying, if somebody rode a horse down East Broadway 200 years ago, 60 kilometers an hour, well, they were breaking the law because the speed limit's 50. Well, actually, the speed limit didn't exist 200 years ago. So they didn't break a law. You can't break a law that doesn't exist yet. So there was no law against that, and that's simply how it would have had to have happened. Or there have been some who claim that perhaps there were other, I won't get into it, but there are other answers that, again, using the evolutionary process. Some I find more intriguing than others. But I have no problem with Cain would have initially married a sister. And then God, when it was no longer necessary to do that, and when God then made that, you cannot do that because that will destroy the family unit. But for a time, it was necessary, and it was innocent at that time. So there's that. And the other thing so the population would have expanded very quickly. And it also could have been with the Cain, anybody who harms him. By that time, there could have been all sorts of people living around there. I mean, statistically, the population would have grown relatively quickly. So even if it had been the neighboring village, he's just warning. He's just telling him, listen, nobody can take vengeance on this guy. So it's again a poetic device as well, I think. Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's very topical as well. So, I mean, and this is another perfect example of why scientism fails, because scientism, there's no philosophy of science, there's no moral guiding principle outside of the natural realm. So if all there is the physical realm, then the moral realm doesn't exist. We just made it up. And so if I want to, I can have a bunch of babies born for the sole purpose of using their body parts for people who can afford You say, well, that's twisted. But that's his question. We're getting to the point where we can do that. We can use body parts to help people with different diseases and so on. So why not have a farm of body parts, or people that we just breed them to use them to help other people? That's where if humanity, we don't follow the moral code that's been given to us, we devolve into madness. And so the role of a Christ follower in the scientific community is to be that standard, is to hold that standard, and to live according to that standard and say, I'm sorry, I will go only so far, and there are lines I will not cross. But we are bumping up against that, and I think crossing some of those lines as well as you read material more and more, where the scientific community, because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. Because you can do it doesn't mean you ought to do it. And but the more we get a society that is godless and has no ultimate values, the more we push up against a world that you don't want to live in. So all Y chromosomes go back to Adam. Mitochondrial goes back to Eve. So it's not mitochondrial with Adam, it's Y chromosomes from Adam.
Y chromosome.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So is there any access to the detail of the recent research or something?
So this isn't biblical research. This is simply genetic research. And there are probably people in this room who know far more about this than I do. But if you just Google, Y chromosomal Adam, and that's not the term Christians have given them, that's the term they use, the geneticists use, Y chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve, you'll read the research.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure. I suppose the same way you can't understand the rules or the purpose of a hockey stick by just examining the hockey stick. Its matter, its purpose is not embedded in the matter itself. The purpose, philosophy, theology, explains why, not what. And so science is a study of the natural realm. But just looking at this pen, I don't know what its purpose is. It's not embedded in the pen. I can presume, but it'd be a guess, So it's the nature of theology, it's the nature of philosophy to be it's another form of knowledge, and that's what we're talking about scientism. Science is the natural science, the scientific method is only one realm of knowledge. There are other realms of knowledge as well. Okay. Now, somebody around here, is this someone on this table a DNA person? Y chromosomal and stuff like that. Am I out to lunch or am I right? Thank you. And you research DNA, you're a geneticist. What are the odds? Thank you. Anyone else? So, the concept that death began at the fall, I'm not convinced is a biblical concept. Some hold to that. I personally don't. I personally don't believe that in the Garden of Eden, before Adam and Eve sinned, if you stepped on a bug, that bug wouldn't die. In fact, I'm convinced that death was possible before the fall because Scripture says there was the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Well, if it wasn't possible to die, why did they need a tree of life? So I think when Scripture talks about death, it's talking about spiritual death, spiritual separation from God. I think death was possible. I think if Adam, fell down in the Garden of Eden, he would have skinned his knee and it would have hurt. So I don't think this concept of death only happened after sin, I don't think that's a biblical concept. And so dinosaurs, sure, they could have existed and lived and died prior to Adam and Eve. No issue with that whatsoever. And biblically, again, it comes back to the how. We're not sure how it all came about, but it's a fact that dinosaurs lived. And depending on your understanding of paleontology and how much you trust the different dating methods, carbon dating and all that, they lived a long time ago. And whether humans lived at the same time, now that's debated. And godly, intelligent people can disagree on that. But there's no doubt that they existed. None whatsoever. Thank you. It is incest now, but it wasn't against the law at that time. And one of the reasons why incest is improper now is because it's not necessary. It's biologically, genetically damaging. But at the very beginning, when the gene pools were very different than they are now, it would not have been a risk, let me put it that way. But also it's just, societally, it's just damaging, toxic now. But at the very beginning, it would have been a physical necessity. That is one option. Psychology is a branch of study, but in what's my personal view, I personally know people who have been helped immensely by psychiatrists and by psychology. But just like there are good doctors and there are bad doctors, there are good pastors and there are bad pastors, there are good psychiatrists and there are bad psychiatrists. And so it's the same. So some people have a bad experience with someone in that field who perhaps are applying theories that are untested, unproven, or unwise. And so psychology, the history of psychology is filled with all sorts of really bad ideas that have now been debunked. So you just need to be careful the theory or the philosophy behind the treatment that you're receiving. Because not all treatments are equal, not all treatments are valid, be it the physical realm or be it in the realm of psychology or of the mind. So I know people who have personally been benefited. I personally visited a therapist a few years ago and spent time in a therapist's office and counselor and helping me to think through some things in my own life and experience. I found them very helpful. Other people, you go to some counselors and therapists and they go, oh, that was a waste of time. And if you're here and you're a therapist, I apologize, but you know it's true. So it all just depends on the skill and the philosophy and the education of the individual with whom you're interacting. But in itself, the field of psychology, is it bad? No, not that I can see. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. Next week, folks, the whole issue of hell. Why would a loving God create a hell? What is it? Is it eternal separation from God? Are people tormented in this fire and all this stuff? What is that all about? We're going to answer those questions next week. Thank you for being here. Next week's the last week of Skeptic.